So maybe some 70 or 80 trillions of dollars were stolen from the working class and the middle class and put in the pockets of the very rich. That's the United States. Similar things were happening elsewhere. End result, a lot of people are angry, frustrated, resentful, looking for something to blame for the ugly situation in which they are, posing the contempt for institutions. Easily understandable and justifiable.
Hello, Chomsky. Thank you for doing this AMA. So the way it's going to work is some people are going to ask the question through voice, and others have written down the questions, and I'm going to read out those questions for you.
Okay.
So we can just begin with the first person who's going to ask you is Avi, and he's going to ask you via voice. So you can just go, Avi.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So the question I have for you relates to animal ethics. And the question is, I take it that if we were doing to animals, if we were doing to humans what we were doing to animals right now. So for example, if we were taking humans and breeding them in an agricultural system and then slaughtering them at a given time point and then using their flesh and their products for consumption, I take it that you wouldn't be okay with that sort of system. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah, and I take it that the current, or at least some forms of the current systems in which we are breeding animals for eventual slaughter and consumption of their flesh or products, I take it that you would be okay with that, or are you not okay with that?
I think sooner or later we will probably get to the stage where we don't do it. But to stop at this point, there are things that I do that I wouldn't do to humans. For example, if a mosquito's bothering me, I kill the mosquito. If a wild animal, say a bobcat, comes to the house, I sometimes even call Animal Rescue League. If a person came, I wouldn't do that. So there are lots of things I do that I wouldn't do to humans.
Well, barring the situation where there's a threat or a nuisance imposition,
the mosquito isn't a threat; it's just an annoyance.
Or even an annoyance in that kind of context, because the thing is, we're not taking mosquitoes and breeding them and then
sure we
them
are.
Well, I mean, we are.
That's not true. I mean, we are.
Okay, sure.
We're breeding mosquitoes
for other
to be
purposes.
sterile, so as to kill off mosquitoes and end malaria.
So for those kind of contexts. So, but in the context where we don't have those kind of utility, these types of considerations, I just take it if we're just growing them for their nutrition or for their flesh or whatnot. I just want to know, because I'll just take it. Let's just take the really simple example. Like, let's say with a cow or a pig or a chicken.
Yeah.
We're growing them, and I take it that you would or would not be okay with growing a cow or a pig or a chicken.
I'll be okay with it. Look, I'm not okay with the fact that right now we're killing millions of species at a rate that hasn't been done for 65 million years. I'm not okay with that. And we have finite energy, right? Finite time and energy. We can decide, agreeing with you, that we should have care and responsibility for animals. I would now raise the question, what's the best way to do it? Well, with the finite time and energy we have, I have at least, I think by far the best way to do it is to eliminate this massive species destruction of the sixth extinction. That overwhelms anything. So that's a good place to start. Then we can get to other things which are more difficult. For example, what you're talking about raises the question how people are going to survive in most of the world. Like people like you and me are I assume you, certainly me, are relatively privileged. People have time to spend, some time on the internet talking, are relatively privileged. We can find ways to get around it. Most of the world can't.
So are you okay with the system in which pigs and chickens and cows are bred for their meat?
I think I would like to find a way around it, but priorities are that we should do what we can to save huge numbers of species from extinction. That's a higher priority. Maybe you're okay with that. I'm not okay with it.
So if there was a system where humans were being bred for their flesh, would you say that it's not the best thing, but we have higher priorities to look for?
If the higher priority is extinction of huge number of species, I would certainly have to raise that question. Now, unlike you, I really think it's totally wrong to be carrying out activities which are destroying species at a rate that hasn't been seen for 65 million years. I think that's a very high priority. Okay, so the finite time and energy that I have, I think it makes more sense to devote to that. Perfectly fine to try to work on ending the breeding of animals. That's a good thing too. You have to think about it's a matter of ranking it in priorities and working out exactly how you do it without slaughtering hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I don't know what you mean when you say unlike me. I'm not disagreeing with you when you say the species extinction is
Okay.
so yeah, I'm not. I'm just saying that I'm just trying to understand if you would give like the same sort of response if there was a world in which humans were being farmed and killed for their flesh. Like, would you go to a grocery store and
If the choice would be to spend my time to prevent humans from being slaughtered, or spend the same amount of time to prevent huge numbers of species, including humans, from being driven to extinction, I would pick the latter.
so
I
when you go
assume you would too.
Well, if me, if there would really be this huge, massive extinction, if I were to
No,
stop
Tom, Mike, it's happening.
yeah,
I'm
no,
not.
I understand, I'm saying if it wouldn't, if this huge, massive extinction, wouldn't be prevented had I not, reached my hand out and grabbed the, human flesh from a grocery store and purchased it, then sure, I would grant that I would purchase the human flesh.
Okay. And
Do you?
every time you drive, turn on the heat and so on, you're contributing, as we all are, to the mass extinction that's going on. So we have an array of choices. We have to decide what the priorities are. A lot of things we don't like. So we have to ask, what can we do most effectively to put an end to practices that we don't like? And to me, it seems that the highest priority is to end the destruction of the environment, in which right now we're in the midst of a process of eliminating, totally extinguishing huge number of species, and also threatening with humans with the end of organized human life in a decade or two. If we don't solve it then, it'll be basically beyond redemption. So those are choices we have to make with the finite time and energy that we have.
Do you see the choices as like a dichotomy in any way? Like, do you think there could be
Probably.
compatibility? Like, for example, like one can go to the grocery store if they were selling human flesh and say, "Wow, this is really abhorrent." And yes, we should also probably make enact policies such that we should reduce our carbon footprint, we should reduce our land usage, etc.
Those are meaningless comparisons. If you want an accurate comparison, the choice would be between eating human flesh and destroying millions of species and human species among them? That would be a relevant question.
I'm not trying to. I'm just trying to point out that they're not mutually exclusive, right? Like you can take a view that, the consumption of human flesh is abhorrent, the purchase of human flesh is abhorrent, and
Right.
also the extinction of the millions of species are also
Yes.
abhorrent, right? So
Right.
yeah.
And since you have a finite amount of time and energy, if those are the choices as to how to devote that time and energy, I think we would both agree that ending the destruction of millions of species and human lives has priority. But if
Okay,
you're
so
giving meaningless comparisons, we can't talk about it.
yeah, I just take it that even if you want to devote your energy to avoiding the destruction of the millions of species, that if there was so just to be clear, so if there was a grocery store selling human flesh, the way you would approach this is if you were to go in the grocery store and look at the human flesh, your approach would be, well, that's pretty bad, but given that we have a
Your
finite amount.
approach would be because you agree that if the choice is between eating human flesh and destroying all life on Earth, you would pick the former.
Yeah, I
So
just don't think.
you agree. We both
I
agree.
just well. The thing is, I don't think they're. I don't think it's dichotomous, right? So I think
No,
that.
it's not that. It's on. Nor is your discussion your choice dichotomous. You were posing a particular dichotomy. I'm saying that's the wrong dichotomy. There's a relevant dichotomy. And in fact, that's a choice that arises for us every day in our lives. Like every day you drive your car, or I do. Every day you turn the heat up instead of putting a sweater on and on. You're contributing to the destruction, as am I, to the destruction of millions of species and human existence on Earth. So we have to make those choices, and you make
Yeah, and
them, and I make them.
So I just want to get a clear answer to this question. So if there was a grocery store that was producing human flesh, would you look at that purchase of the human flesh as morally abhorrent, or would you take an approach in which right now in the real world, like tomorrow, there's a grocery store that sells human flesh?
Yeah,
You would
like
you would Yeah, go ahead.
if you insist on posing a meaningless question, of course I can't answer it. If you would like to look at a meaningful question is a choice: eating human flesh or contributing directly to the destruction of all species, of millions of species, including humans. And I would do what you would do, former, the latter. I would put my energy in the latter. If you prefer not to put your energy there, that's fine. I think you're wrong, but it's a mistake. But it's fine. You make your choices, but don't pose meaningless questions.
Well, so two things. So since the question wasn't answered, and was
It
dismissed as
was
meaningless.
It
So
was
the reason it's
if the choice is between not heating your home, never driving, never using fossil fuels, or contributing to the destruction of huge numbers of species and humans, which one do you pick?
a choice between not heating my home and fossil fuels or contributing to the destruction of millions of species. It would depend on my answer is it would depend on the nature.
I'm telling you, it's not depending on. These are the facts.
No, I understand.
Every time you use heat, every time you drive your car, you're deciding that destruction of the human species is less important than what I'm doing now. So don't avoid the question by posing something meaningless.
Okay. I think Pogan wants to go next to ask his question. So we're just gonna move on. Chomsky. Let's see. Pogan, can you speak?
Yeah. Hi, Professor Chomsky. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, it's an honor to be able to speak to you. I have a couple political questions and then a question about ecological collapse. The first question I wanted to ask is, during the 2020 presidential election, you spoke at length on the merits of lesser of two evils politics and focused on why it would be beneficial to vote for virtually any Democratic candidate rather than Donald Trump. And this runs in direct contrast with the position taken by members of the so-called far left and socialist revolutionaries who maintain that participation and promotion of bourgeois politics serves to benefit the elite aristocratic class and makes it more difficult for workers to actually achieve socialism. They contend that any political action that reduces to maintaining capitalism in some way is an action that the left should not condone. How do you respond to such questions, and how do you justify participation in so-called bourgeois democracy while ostensibly desiring an end to capitalism?
I would respond the same way I've responded 1,000 times. The choice on November 4th was very simple. Either you vote against Trump or you decide to help Trump win. People you're calling on the left are actually on the far right. They were choosing to help Trump win. That was exactly the choice. And choosing to help Trump win means calling for another 4 years of destruction of the environment, increasing the threats of major war, other things which I can mention. That has nothing to do with social revolution, absolutely nothing.
Right.
It was simply a decision to say, I prefer to see Trump in office than to see him out. That was the choice. There was no other choice. The choice wasn't between social revolution and voting for Biden. The choice was between voting against Trump or voting to help Trump. That was the choice.
Okay, fair enough. My next question is a little more on the economic side. Some prominent leftist scholars, such as Marxian economist Richard Wolff, have advocated for the use of markets in some socialist societies, or they don't entirely subscribe to the belief that central planning is desirable. Do you have a position on the debate between advocates of markets and central planning? Do you believe that central planning is feasible given certain considerations like the economic calculation problem and the local knowledge problem? And is it necessarily the case that markets lead to distinct economic classes and unequal exchanges?
Oh, none of this is necessary. It all depends on many considerations that you didn't mention. So, for example, when you talk about central planning, the real question is obscured. Who's going to decide on the central planning? Will it be an autocratic authority who decides, say, the central committee of some party, or will it be a deliberative decision made from popular workers' organizations, other popular organizations, picking representatives who deliberate and decide on a general plan? That's the distinction. I prefer the latter. There's both cases have general planning, but they're quite different. With regard to markets, depends exactly on how they're used and in what way they're used. So, for example, a pre-democratic society with no legitimate authority participating all the way through could decide to use markets as a means of gaining information without any further consequences. I think that would be a realistic use of markets, maybe. With regard to the calculation problem, that's just a joke. Yes, it's true that markets give an answer relative to the distribution of income. So if the distribution of income is radically skewed, few people have tens of billions of dollars, most people are scraping to exist, and a market will give a perfect solution, solve the calculation problem, yield to Pareto optimality. The market should produce super yachts for the billionaires and bags of potato chips for everyone else. An answer to the problem. It's just not an interesting problem. The question is, what's the right answer? Not the one that's given by some algorithm that you think up, which is what a market basically is. So I don't even think that's a question.
Okay, fair enough. I tend to agree. I have two more questions for you, and I'll be brief because there are, of course, other people. My next question is, the path to socialism is fraught with attempts by the establishment and the capitalist class to infiltrate, oppress, ridicule, slander, or otherwise dismantle pro-worker movements. When such movements are successful, the change they implement is either relatively minor to the sheer scale and size of the exploitative capitalist system, or they sometimes result in authoritarian regimes, as was the case in the Soviet Union, China, etc. You've stated in the past that societies like the Soviet Union aren't socialist, but this is questioned by critics on the basis that there are no other examples of worker states after the Industrial Revolution that abolished the bourgeois, aside from these societies commonly mentioned. How do socialists simultaneously defend themselves from the optically poor outcomes of these societies while ensuring that the changes they implement are not immediately erased or mitigated by the capitalist class?
So if you want to look at the, take the Soviet Union, in the year 1917 was a revolutionary year. A lot of popular uprisings. When the Bolshevik Revolution took place, power was centralized, much as was predicted long before by Rosa Luxemburg, other left Marxists. Power was centralized, and it was used to undermine and dissolve the socialist institutions that had developed during the revolutionary year. Now, that's not the way to defend socialism. You might ask a different question. Suppose there was an authentic socialist revolution, wasn't destroyed by centralized power, and suppose it was attacked violently. How would you defend yourself against it? Well, lots of different ways, depending on the circumstances. One way might be a political war, which seeks to undermine support from the attackers by appealing to their own army and dissolving it from within. That's a political approach. Another is guerrilla war. Let's take a concrete case where these were options. Take the anarchist revolution in Spain in 1936. It was attacked mainly by the communists who were in the lead of trying to destroy it. They were the party of the police and the bourgeoisie. They were joined by the fascists. They were joined by liberal democracies. Now, what was the way to respond? Well, the way that was chosen was to join the Republic and fight a standard war against the communist, fascist, and other forces. That didn't work. There was an alternative that was suggested, and I think was of some significance, suggested by Milo Berneri, the anarchist activist who was murdered by the communists on the crushing of the communist revolution in 1938, the anarchist revolution by the communists in 1938. But his proposal was just what I suggested. They said a classic war against these armies is not going to work. But he thought that what could be done was to undermine Franco's armies. And that was not impossible. Franco's armies were Moorish. They were based on Moroccans, people from Spanish Morocco. There was a guerrilla war going on against the Spanish occupation, the Abdel Krim War. What Berneri suggested is that the revolutionary forces should work together with the guerrilla forces in Morocco, support land reform, other measures which would undermine Franco's army from within. Well, of course, that had a downside. The liberal democracies would go berserk. The fascists would go berserk. Communists would be opposed, of course. But it was a possibility. And I think it's the kind of thing you should think through. And he also suggested in Spain itself, they should resort to guerrilla war. So those are the kinds of realistic options that have to be considered when you have the kind of situation you're talking about. There's no general answer for all circumstances, or only particular choices in particular circumstances.
Okay, thank you. And this is my last question, and then we'll move on, I think, This is a fairly brief one. Based on all the information that you've read, all the data that you've had access to, do you believe that humans will be able to prevent widespread ecological collapse, or by the time there is an incentive for the major actors in our societies to move towards preventing it, will it be too late, or is it already too late, in your view?
It's not too late now. It will be too late in another couple of decades. That's one of the reasons why it was imperative to make sure that Trump doesn't win the election. That was maybe the highest imperative in human history. And people who didn't understand that were living in some other universe. Another 4 years of Trump would have meant more dedicated efforts to maximize the use of fossil fuels, including the most dangerous of them, and more elimination of any of the means to mitigate the disaster. It could have well led to irreversible tipping points. At the very least, it would have made the window of opportunity that we have much narrower. But that was imperative. Well, okay, we did that. Next thing to do is to impose maximal pressures, popular pressures, to ensure that the government undertake the kinds of measures that are necessary, that are necessary to reach the point where the crisis becomes manageable, and also to impose massive pressures on the fossil fuel corporations, the banks that fund them, to make them stop what they're doing. And another thing that must be done, unfortunately is being done, is for activists to be working with working people in these industries, to bring them to recognize that for survival, it's going to be necessary to end the use of fossil fuels, and that there are methods, there are options. Here they are. I'll present them to you for you to have better jobs, better lives, and better work. That's actually partially succeeding. So, for example, about a week ago, the Cheryl Roberts, the head of the mine workers union, did make a statement saying that the mine workers in West Virginia, crucial state, are interested in pursuing a transition away from the use of coal to a sustainable environment, recognizing there's been a lot of work done there to bring to them the options that are available to do this. Well, all of these things are being done here, in other countries. The answer to your question will be given by how much work is devoted to carrying out these activities against the forces that you mentioned will be trying to impede them. That's happening at every level. Take say, the Biden administration, under pressure from Sunrise Movement, other activists, they did come forth with the most forthcoming climate program that has yet been put forth officially. Not a bad program, but it's nowhere near enough. When you look at it closely, a lot of it is following the policy of what's sometimes called decarbonization. Let's devote efforts working on how to remove the poisons from the atmosphere. Meanwhile, we keep pouring them in. ExxonMobil is pursuing the same line. And, we're good citizens. We should agree that we should get to net zero emissions by the mid-century, and here's the way to do it. Keep using fossil fuels, but work on some conceivable long-term technology to remove the poisons from the atmosphere. If the Biden administration is going to go in that direction, it's a kiss of death. So efforts have to be made to ensure that net zero emissions means no emissions, not we'll balance them by some way to remove the poisons from the atmosphere. This is not just carbon, also methane and other lethal gases. These are the issues that are right in front of us. And the answer to your question will be how determined and committed are people like you, others, to work to achieve these ends. No one can know the answer to that. That's a matter of choice. No way of telling.
Yeah, I actually thank you very much for the answer. I happen to be from West Virginia myself, so that's good to hear about the coal mine workers. Those were all of my questions. I'm more than happy to yield and let somebody else go. Thank you very much for your time, Professor Chomsky.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to Canadian Catholic. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I did.
You want to ask? Yeah, go ahead.
All right, thank you so much. First of all, Dr. Chomsky, I want to thank you so much for doing these interviews. We're humbled to have you, and I do not speak only for myself, but for everybody in here. I had several questions, in fact. One was, some time ago, there was a publicized correspondence between you and a neuroscientist, Sam Harris. Could you share your thoughts on that, and what was the context of that? That would be my first question, and I will move on to the second after that.
Correspondence took place because of Harris's radical falsification of views of mine, to which I responded. And then it went on that point. I didn't see much point to it. I have no interest in pursuing it. But that was the issue.
I see. So, Dr. Chomsky, a brief question about politics. What do you say to those who believe that voting for the lesser of the two evils is a fundamentally flawed strategy? And by continuing to do this, we are simply ensuring that this option will continue. This option of having two evils and having to choose from them will simply continue to exist. How do you respond to that, and what are your thoughts of those who believe that sitting out elections entirely in protest is a more dignified position?
I respond to it by saying I agree with it. The way I've agreed with it all my life. I still do. That's why plenty of times I didn't even bother voting. But of course, we have to live with the real world as it exists. There are circumstances in which voting against someone is important. So this whole issue of focusing on elections is basically an establishment position. Establishment wants us to believe that the politics consists of showing up once every 4 years and pushing a lever and going home. Couldn't fall for that. Politics never stops. Consists of your constant, ongoing activism. Every 4 years, an event comes up called an election, and you can take a few minutes to decide whether it's worthwhile to vote in that election, typically to vote against somebody. Is it worthwhile to take a little time to do that and go back to work, or is it not worthwhile? And sometimes it is worthwhile. That was very clearly the case in 2020, and no exaggeration to say that the fate of survival of many forms of life on Earth, including us, was at stake. Yes, for that, it's worth taking off a few minutes to push a lever and go back to work.
I see. And my final question will be about language. Dr. Chomsky, do you believe that there is absolutely no way to rescue empiricist conceptions of language, theories like tabula rasa, for example, that humans do not have any innate faculties towards language, but rather develop them as they experience the world?
Well, empiricism covers quite a range, so it depends what form of empiricism you mean. There is what's called enlightened empiricism, which says, let's just look for the best theory, consistent with whatever evidence we have. Nothing wrong with that. That's basically what came out of the discovery in the 17th century that there's no hope for foundationalism. It was essentially shown pretty much by Newton and finally got absorbed. So if you mean enlightened empiricism, let's seek the best theory based on what evidence we have. I'm all for it. Best theories that we know, in fact, the only theories we know that have any hope of accounting for anything, or that humans have a specific endowment, species quality, common to humans, not shared with any other organisms. Overwhelming evidence for that, which is part of our genetic endowment and provides for us the faculty to acquire the capacity that we're now using. It used to be common to all humans. Again, there's no analog in other organisms. So that's the innate basis for developing the language faculty. It's not at all surprising to biologists. They take it for granted that something like this must be the case. And by now we know a certain amount about it, or learning more. So I think the general question about empiricism just doesn't mean very much until one says, what kind of empiricism?
I see. Thank you so much, Dr. Chomsky, for addressing my questions, and I will yield my time to somebody else.
Okay, then we're gonna move on to the next question. Doug wanted to ask 2 questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you guys hear my mic? Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so hello, Dr. Chomsky. My first question is this. So Quine has an argument for the indeterminacy of meaning and the non-existence of meaning that you've been very critical of. Can you explain what the problem with Quine's argument is, in your opinion?
Well, actually, the problem was that Quine claimed that indeterminacy of meaning was something over and above normal indeterminacy of all science. So in physics, your conclusions are indeterminate. They go way beyond the evidence, always. So you're making speculations about what might be true. There's underdetermination in all of scientific inquiry. His claim was that in the case of meaning, there's something over and beyond underdetermination. I don't think he was ever able to establish that. In fact, if you look closely, he withdrew it. It's a paper that very few people read, but it's an important one. You can find it in the symposium of the New York University Philosophy of Science publications published in 1969. And if you look at that symposium, it was a discussion in which Quine participated, I participated, several others did. Read Quine's paper. In it, he says, we have to accept the innate qualities that carry us from observation to theses about the nature of language, including the nature of meaning. Well, if we have to accept these innate qualities and the way they carry us over the gap from that's inherent in underdetermination, then the outcome is just part of normal science, which means that the whole set of claims collapses. Well, it's not clear how to interpret this paper. In it, if you read it, you'll see Quine basically abandoned all of these claims. He never returned to that, then just returned to the claims. Although I think his conclusion was quite accurate. You have to accept the innate faculties, in which case everything disappears. Well, you can make up, this is avoided. There's a massive literature about Quine, but this paper is always avoided. I don't think it should be. Actually, I've written about it, but I think I'm the only one who has. So, but I think his conclusion was correct. There's no way to avoid accepting the innate qualities, whatever they turn out to be. And then what's left is just normal underdetermination.
I see. Thank you for that. My other question is regarding the labor theory of value. Many people, such as famous internet Marxist Jack Engstrich, has said he favors the labor theory of value because of its epistemic virtues. You know, things like unification, explanatory scope, explanatory power. What do you think about this claim? Do you think that the labor theory of value is supported, or do you think it is fallen out of favor with economists for good reason?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the claim that you're discussing. Could you state it again?
Yeah, so my question just pertains to the labor theory of value. Do you think that
Labor
it's a
theory
good
of
theory?
value.
Yeah.
The labor theory of value was developed by Smith and Ricardo, elaborated and extended by Marx. It was further developed in interesting ways by working people in the 19th century who actually didn't know Marx, but they did know Smith and Ricardo, who produced it as a basis for their claim that any capture of labor, of the results of labor by somebody who didn't perform the labor, is illegitimate. So if a worker is working in an enterprise and the boss appropriates a certain part of the labor, that's illegitimate because he's stealing the results of their labor. It's an interesting view. I think it makes sense. Not what's usually talked about in the labor theory of value, which gets into discussions along other dimensions about what's the nature of value. I personally don't find those discussions very interesting, but can pursue them. But what is interesting, I think, is the idea that came out of the workers' movements, often by people with no formal education, I should say, like Thomas Skidmore and others, developed a sophisticated approach arguing that any form of employment is illegitimate. It means that master is stealing what is produced by the labor of someone else. So it was a sharp attack on the entire notion of an employment contract. And that was a leading theme of the workers' movements. I'm talking about the United States now. The workers' movements in the United States in the late 19th century. It's Knights of Labor, others. I think that isn't given the attention and emphasis that it deserves. But the general discussions about value, I think, go off in some other direction. You get into arguments about whether putting in capital is value and so on.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we're gonna move on to the text questions now. So the first question is, how do you think American, and the question is from Teriyaki Madness, how do you think American imperialist policies are going to evolve over the course of the Biden administration? Biden was quite war hawkish during the build-up to the Iraq War. Do you see the streak as continuing?
That's answer is that's up to you. These policies aren't graven in stone. What policies will be pursued depend on the various domestic international forces that are operative. We can affect the domestic forces. Now, right now, the Biden administration policies are pretty much taken over from the Trump administration. I think they're very dangerous, destructive, and I think we should work hard to change them. I can talk about particular cases, but case after case, I think that's true. Take, say, Iran, one of the major cases. Trump, Biden's, I should say there is a difference between Trump and Biden. So Trump, in addition to the imperialist policies, happened to add a particularly savage twist to each of them. A lot of just gratuitous savagery, which wasn't part of the policy, just his general hatred and contempt for human beings. So, for example, take Gaza, which is being destroyed, devastated by US-backed policies. Trump made it worse by cutting a single lifeline that Gazans have to some sort of survival, namely the UNRWA support. Just cut that off out of pure savagery, not part of the policy. He even gave his reasons. He said the Palestinians didn't show enough respect for him when he sold them down the river with his peace plan. So therefore, he cut off the means of survival. Okay, that's the kind of thing I don't think Biden will do. He's not committed to pure savagery the way the Trump administration was. They were an unusual gang of sociopaths, but the policies are basically the same. So the policies of crushing Gaza remain the same. Take Iran. Biden's rhetoric is a little bit different. He says, yeah, we'd like to get back to some kind of negotiate to some kind of agreement. But you take a look at the actual explicit proposals that's coming out, they're the same as Trump's. The United States under Trump pulled out of the agreement in violation of Security Council orders, imposed very harsh and brutal sanctions, and insisted that there won't be any negotiations unless Iran agrees to not to go back to the original one, but to accept a much harsher agreement with much greater constraints on Iran. Absolutely no justification for that. The whole world is against it, but the U.S. is powerful enough to disregard the world on this and many other issues. Well, Biden's accepted that. He says, yeah, it's okay to have negotiations, but they have to be on a new agreement with harsher terms. Meanwhile, the crushing sanctions continue. Okay, that's Iran. Take China. There's near unanimity in the political class, the discussions, the articulate discussions, that we're facing a terrible threat from China. We have to confront it. Ask yourself, what exactly is the China threat? In fact, ask the people who advance this claim, which is virtually everyone. You won't find an answer. But try to figure it out. Exactly what's the threat of China? I mean, China's doing a lot of pretty rotten things internally, for example. Is that a threat to us? Now, there are confrontations in the South China Sea. In the South China Sea, China is carrying out operations of the kind that it shouldn't be doing. They're in violation of international law. They infringe on the rights of other countries in the region, Vietnam, Philippines, others. So that's wrong. Put it in other terms, China is doing exactly what Australia did. There was an international court ruling on the boundary between Australia and East Timor. Australia didn't like it because Australia wants to steal the oil of the country of East Timor that had helped devastate. So it simply said, we're not going to accept the agreement. Okay, that's what China's doing. You can't talk about the United States because the United States doesn't accept any agreements. The United States has been condemned by the World Court for international terrorism. Just told them to get lost. The United States is carrying out piracy on the high seas in violation of most fundamental international law. try to impose its blockade on Cuba and Venezuela and to attack Iran. Gross violation of international law. Of course, nobody can say anything about it because you can't criticize the Godfather or you're in trouble. But yes, China's doing wrong things. The United States has no status whatsoever to say anything about them. Now, a sane policy would be to move towards negotiations and diplomacy and try to resolve this conflict peaceably. A lunatic solution is to send a naval armada into the South China Sea while Chinese bombers are flying overhead. That's utterly crazy. It's just there could be any kind of accident that could spiral off to major war, which could mean terminal war. So yes, this is one of the cases where you need diplomacy and negotiations, but it's very hard to consider that a major threat. What's usually talked about as the threat is Chinese economic advancement, and that's going to prevent the United States from being first in the world. Is that a threat? I mean, why is that a threat? If China advances, it's to the benefit of all of us. If you don't think you should be sending jobs to China, fine. Bang on the doors of the corporations which are doing this for their own profit. It's not a national threat. Okay, in fact, there is none. It's building it up as a threat, or the major threat that we have to face, could have very harsh consequences. Same is true of provocations on the Russian border. Same in many other places. So there are plenty of problems in international affairs. I think there are sane and sensible ways of dealing with them. The Biden administration is not pursuing them. And I think what's required is substantial pressure, first of all, to dismantle massive propaganda and expose it for what it is, and then to move on towards more sensible policies. That's true in every country, Canada as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Newbies asks, in your opinion, what do you think the cause is for the rise of moral skepticism and moral relativism in modern times?
It always exists. It comes to a peak at certain moments. And the reason we have to ask why this particular moment. And I think there's a pretty good reason for it. We have been living under a 40-year general assault on the general population. This is true in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, much of the rest of the world, India. The assault has a name. It's called neoliberalism. It's a program, international program initiated mainly by the US and Britain back around 1980. It is a program designed to concentrate wealth and power in a tiny sector of the population and to smash everyone else. It was explicit. And if you look at Reagan, his first inaugural address said, government is the problem. We have to get government out of our affairs. Well, that means decisions will not be made by government, will be made by somebody else. Who's the somebody else? Private power. The decisions don't disappear. Shift over to private power. Totalitarian institutions, private corporations, what corporations are. So we'll shift decisions away from government, which is under some popular influence at least, some accountability to the public. We'll shift it over to concentrations of private power, which are totally unaccountable to anyone and just are committed to maximizing their own profit. That was, in fact, emphasized by economic guru of the program, Milton Friedman, who came out with a famous article in which he said the only responsibility of a corporation is to maximize its own profit. Okay, here's a program, and another part of the program is we have to destroy labor unions. So the first acts of Thatcher and Reagan were to smash labor unions. Good reason. If you're going to attack the general population, you have to eliminate the one means by which they can defend themselves. Here's a three-pronged program. Transfer decisions to private, unaccountable institutions which are committed to maximizing profit for themselves and eliminate any form of defense. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what's going to happen. And it happened. We even have some numbers now. The highly respectable Rand Corporation just did a study on what they call the transfer of wealth from, I would call it robbery, the transfer of wealth from the lower 90% of the population, from the working class and the middle class, transfer of wealth from them, the very super rich, which means, in fact, the top 0.1%, which doubled their wealth, share of wealth from 10% to 20%. Well, their estimate of the robbery is $47 trillion, which is not small change. It's an underestimate. They didn't look into other things. When Reagan essentially told the corporate world, do whatever you like, rob as much as you like, of course they did it. They turned to things like tax havens, which were illegal before, and the law was enforced. That's another tens of trillions of dollars. So maybe some 70 or 80 trillions of dollars were stolen from the working class and the middle class and put in the pockets of the very rich. That's the United States. Similar things were happening elsewhere. End result, a lot of people are angry, frustrated, resentful, looking for something to blame for the ugly situation in which they are, posing a contempt for institutions. Easily understandable and justifiable. Well, that's the kind of terrain in which people will turn to wild conspiracy theories for some explanation. The problem is immigrants, blacks, the deep state that's doing something to you. The people who are inventing the pandemic in order to control you, any crazy thing you can think of. So that's the job of serious activists to reconstitute the labor movement, bring back an atmosphere of rationality and honest discussion where you can turn to the real causes and deal with them. Of course, this is fertile terrain for demagogues, con men, Trump variety. You can say, I'm your savior, well, continues to stab you in the back. It's happening all over the world. India's literally collapsing now, largely because of that. The neoliberal programs in India, starting in the 90s, a little later than here, they devastated the agricultural system by withdrawing public support from it. Hundreds of thousands of farmer suicides, where you're seeing enormous strikes of farmers now. They also pretty much eliminated the public health system, turned it over to privatization, which is, of course, a disaster, as it is here. So now you're seeing what you see in India, total collapse. And similar things have been happening in many places. So yes, it is a kind of situation in which wild, crazed conspiracy theories can flourish. And that's a lot of work to do to overcome that.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Well, I guess we could, since that was the last question, we could end now.
I'll have to leave now. I have another appointment coming up.
Oh, yeah, thank you for doing this AMA, and we hope that you can do something again in the future.
I'm glad to have a chance to talk to you.